Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Salem, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1888 when Catherine Holloway made a decision that would cast a shadow over 3 generations of her family. Salem, Massachusetts, a town already steeped in a history it was desperate to forget, would harbor yet another dark chapter within its cobblestone streets and weathered colonial architecture. The Holloway residence stood at the corner of Essex and Summer Streets, a Georgian-style home built in the 1760s with its characteristic symmetrical facade and central door. Unlike many of the grander homes in Salem that had been maintained by shipping fortunes, the Holloway home carried a subtle decay that residents of Essex Street had grown accustomed to overlooking. County records indicate that by 1888, the household consisted of Catherine Holloway, aged 42, her husband Edmund Holloway, 51, their son Elijah, 24, and their daughter Margaret, 17. A fifth presence in the home, though seldom acknowledged in public documents, was Rebecca Winters, 38, described in census records merely as household help, though her actual position in the family dynamic would later become the subject of much speculation. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not just what happened to the Holloways, but how methodically the events were documented and then subsequently buried from public knowledge. The existence of Catherine's diary might have remained unknown were it not for the renovation of the old Salem courthouse in 1903, when a sealed box was discovered in a forgotten storage room behind a loose panel. The courthouse clerk who first examined the contents, Harold Jenkins, reportedly took a leave of absence immediately afterward. He never returned to his position. When contacted for an interview in 1905 by the Salem Evening News about an unrelated matter, his wife simply stated he had gone west for his health. No further record of Jenkins exists in Massachusetts State Archives. The diary itself spans from January 3, 1888 to November 21st of the same year. The entries begin with mundane observations about household matters, social engagements, and the particularly harsh winter that had gripped Salem that year. The handwriting is precise, controlled, the penmanship of someone educated in an era that valued such disciplined formality. By February, subtle changes appear in the entries. Catherine begins to mention the arrangement and our understanding without elaboration. Names are occasionally redacted, even in her private writings, replaced with initials or simply blank spaces. Weather observations become more frequent and detailed, particularly noting the patterns of fog rolling in from the harbor. February 18th, the fog has returned. E says it's nothing more than sea vapor, but it seems to linger around our property particularly. R watches it from the kitchen window for hours. I've forbidden M from walking to school alone when it's thick. What made this fog so noteworthy to Catherine? Meteorological records from that period do indicate an unusually foggy winter and spring in Salem, but nothing that would warrant such fixation. Unless, of course, Catherine was using the weather as a metaphor for something else entirely. Something closing in on the Holloway household. The first truly troubling entry appears on March 4th. E received another letter today. He burned it after reading, as always, but his hands trembled more than usual. R tried to comfort him, which only made matters worse. I reminded them both of our agreement. Some prices are worth paying for security. M asked too many questions at dinner. E sent her to her room without explanation. The poor girl suspects something, but what child wouldn't? The house feels different. Even the walls seem to be listening now. This entry marks a turning point in both tone and content. From this date forward, Catherine's writings take on an increasingly paranoid quality. She describes sounds in the walls, particularly at night. She notes the changing behaviors of family members with clinical detachment, as though observing strangers. Most concerning are her descriptions of her husband Edmund's deteriorating condition. Once a respected shipbuilding consultant whose family had been in the trade for generations, Edmund had apparently suffered a reversal of fortune sometime in the mid-1880s. The specifics are never clarified in Catherine's writings, but town records show the Holloways sold off several properties between 1885 and 1887. A ledger from First Salem Bank, also preserved in the county archives, indicates a substantial loan taken against their remaining property in January 1888, the very month Catherine's diary begins. The loan officer noted in the margin, "Approved despite reservations." Mr. H. appears unwell, but Mrs. H. provides assurances. By April, Catherine's entries become more fragmented. April 2nd. E. hasn't left his study in 3 days. Says he's working, but I hear no movement. Only muttering. R. takes his meals in on a tray and returns with them untouched. M. asked if her father was dying. What a question for a girl to ask about her father. I told her he was merely tired from working. A half-truth at best. Last night I dreamed of the cellar door opening by itself over and over. When I woke, I found myself standing at the top of the cellar stairs. The door was open. I have no memory of leaving my bed. According to records from Dr. James Blackwood, the Holloway family physician, he was summoned to the home on April 7th to examine Edmund. His notes, later subpoenaed in the investigation, describe a man suffering from acute nervous exhaustion and possible melancholia. Dr. Blackwood prescribed rest and a tonic containing laudanum, a common treatment for nervous conditions at the time. He also noted, Mrs. H. declined my suggestion to examine other members of the household, though the daughter M. appears pale, and the household help R. shows signs of similar nervous affliction. Perhaps most telling is what Catherine doesn't write about. Throughout the early months of 1888, Salem experienced several unusual incidents that were reported in the local papers but never mentioned in the diary. 3 local men went missing after last being seen at the harbor. A small fire damaged the rear of a property just 2 doors down from the Holloways. And most notably, Catherine's son Elijah, who was mentioned in January entries as living at home and working as his father's apprentice, disappears entirely from her writings after February 12th. Town records indicate Elijah Holloway continued to be seen around Salem through March, though several accounts describe him as altered or distracted. The owner of a local tavern, in a statement given years later, recalled that Elijah had come in on a Tuesday night in late March, ordered a whiskey, and sat staring at it for nearly an hour without drinking. When addressed, he reportedly said, "My family made a pact that cannot be unmade. I've tried to understand why Mother thought it necessary." He left the untouched whiskey and was never seen in the establishment again. The last confirmed sighting of Elijah Holloway was on April 11, 1888, when he purchased a one-way train ticket to Boston. The ticket seller remembered him because he paid with an unusual gold coin and said something to the effect of, "This journey is costing me far more than this fare." Meanwhile, Catherine's diary entries through April and May become increasingly concerned with the structural integrity of the house itself. May 9th. The eastern wall of the cellar continues to weep. E. says it's merely groundwater seeping through the old foundation, but the liquid is too viscous for water. R. refuses to go down there now, even when I insist. M. asks why the house always smells musty despite all the windows being open. I've taken to burning sage daily, though I tell the others it's just to freshen the air. The odor is strongest near the cellar door. What Catherine was experiencing, or believed she was experiencing, remains open to interpretation. The house still stands on Essex Street, though it has been divided into apartments in the intervening years. In 1912, during a renovation, workers did indeed discover problems with the eastern foundation wall. The contractor's report mentions unusual staining and evidence of previous amateur repair attempts. By summer, Catherine's writing changes again. Her entries become longer, more detailed, but often circle around to the same subjects: the quality of light in different rooms throughout the day, the behavior of dust motes in sunbeams, the precise way shadows fell across the staircase each evening. June 23rd. Observed R. standing motionless in the hallway for 17 minutes this afternoon. When I finally asked what she was doing, she claimed to be listening to the house breathe. I should dismiss such fanciful talk, but I find myself doing the same thing when alone. The rhythm changes depending on who is present. When E is home, the intervals between creaks shorten considerably. The house knows who belongs to it now. During this period, Catherine began to make references to the book and the method, though never with enough context to determine what she meant. Local historians have speculated she may have been referring to one of several occultic or spiritualist texts that were in circulation in New England during that era, though this contradicts the notably practical, even skeptical, tone Catherine maintains, even as her perceptions become increasingly aberrant. What we do know from other sources is that Edmund Holloway's health continued to decline through the summer of 1888. Dr. Blackwood's records show 3 more house calls in July alone. By August, Edmund was bedridden, suffering from what the doctor described as wasting syndrome of unknown origin. Modern medical historians reviewing the symptoms have suggested possibilities ranging from cancer to chronic arsenic exposure, though the latter theory gained particular attention during the 1970s when testing of preserved materials from the Holloway case showed elevated levels of arsenic in a sample of Edmund's hair that had been kept as evidence. Catherine's August entries focus extensively on her husband's deterioration. August 12th, E no longer recognizes M when she brings him tea. He calls her by other names, some female, some not. R says we should send for a priest, but what good would that do now? The pact was made with clear minds and open eyes. Last night, E spoke clearly for the first time in weeks. He looked directly at me and said, "I can hear them in the walls, Catherine. They're counting my breaths." Then he smiled. It was the most terrible thing I've ever seen. It was around this time that neighbors began to take note of unusual patterns at the Holloway home. Delivery boys reported that no one would answer the front door. Parcels had to be left on the step. The milk delivered each morning remained untouched until evening, when it would disappear. Lights were seen moving from room to room throughout the night. Margaret Holloway, the 17-year-old daughter, stopped attending her finishing school sometime in late August. When the headmistress sent a note inquiring about her absence, she received a reply purportedly from Catherine, stating that Margaret was completing her education at home under more appropriate guidance. The handwriting on this note, preserved in the school's records, bears only a passing resemblance to Catherine's diary entries from the same period. By September, Catherine's writing shows signs of severe sleep deprivation. Words slant across the page, thoughts are left unfinished, and she frequently interrupts herself to note sounds or movements that capture her attention. September 9th, the cellar door was open again this morning. R swears she locked it last night, and I believe her. No one goes down there willingly anymore. M says she hears singing coming from below, like a woman humming to a child. I hear nothing but the settling of old wood and stone. E called for Rebecca by another name again today. He reached for her hand and whispered something I couldn't hear. She's been weeping since. I should comfort her, but I find I cannot bear to touch anyone in this house now. The air between us feels thick, as though we're all underwater, drowning in inches of separation. On September 15th, Edmund Holloway died in his home. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Blackwood, lists the cause as general failure of constitution following prolonged nervous exhaustion. No autopsy was performed, as was common in that era when a physician had been attending the deceased. Catherine's entry from that day is unnervingly brief. September 15th. E has fulfilled his part of our arrangement. May he find the peace I bargained away. The events following Edmund's death took a strange turn. Instead of the typical funeral proceedings, Catherine insisted on a closed casket service held in the home rather than at the church. Only 5 people are recorded as attending: Catherine, Margaret, Rebecca, Dr. Blackwood, and the Reverend Thomas Wardwell of the First Church of Salem. The Reverend later confided to a colleague that it was the most uncomfortable service I've ever conducted, and that the widow Holloway seemed more watchful than grieved, as though expecting her husband to interrupt the proceedings at any moment. Edmund was buried in the Holloway family plot at Howard Street Cemetery, a small and already old burial ground that had fallen out of favor with most Salem families by the 1880s. The choice struck many as odd, given that the more prestigious Harmony Grove Cemetery had been established decades earlier and was the preferred resting place for families of the Holloways' former social standing. Catherine's diary entries following the burial become increasingly disjointed. She begins to leave larger gaps between dates, sometimes a week or more. When she does write, her once precise handwriting deteriorates further, and she develops a habit of crossing out entire passages so thoroughly that they cannot be deciphered. October 3rd, M. found the book today. I discovered her in E's study, reading what she should never have seen. When confronted, she looked at me with such accusation that I nearly confessed everything. Instead, I told her it was merely one of her father's scholarly interests, nothing more. She didn't believe me. She's too clever. Always has been. R says we should tell her the truth now, that she deserves to know what's been done. But knowledge is precisely what I've tried to protect her from. Some burdens shouldn't be passed down. This entry raises perhaps the most tantalizing question of the entire case. What was the book that Margaret discovered? What knowledge was Catherine so determined to keep from her daughter? The diary never provides a clear answer, but subsequent events suggest whatever Margaret learned that day set in motion the final tragic chapter of the Holloway family story. On October 7th, Rebecca Winters left the Holloway home. According to a statement she gave years later to a private investigator hired by distant Holloway relatives, she fled in the middle of the night with only the clothes she wore and a small bundle of personal items. She took a pre-dawn coach to Boston and, from there, a ship to Baltimore, where she had a cousin. Her stated reason for this abrupt departure: I could no longer bear to witness what was happening in that house, nor could I stop it. Catherine had gone too far, and Margaret was beginning to follow her down the same terrible path. Rebecca's departure seems to have marked another turning point. Catherine's entries become more lucid again, but with an air of grim determination. October 10th. R has abandoned us, as I always suspected she might when the true cost became clear. No matter, M and I will continue what was started. The house feels lighter without R's constant worrying and second-guessing. M asks good questions now. She wants to understand the mechanism, the precise nature of the exchange. She has her father's mind for details. Yesterday she suggested an improvement to the formula that I hadn't considered. My clever, clever girl. Perhaps this legacy is rightfully hers after all. It's important to note here that no evidence of any actual formula or occult practices was ever found in the Holloway home. When investigators finally searched the premises in 1901, they discovered no unusual items beyond Catherine's diary itself. This has led many historians to conclude that Catherine's writings reflect psychological deterioration rather than any genuine supernatural or criminal activity. However, this theory is complicated by physical evidence that emerged later. In 1920, during road repairs on Essex Street directly in front of the former Holloway property, workers unearthed a small lid box containing 5 objects. A man's pocket watch stopped at 3:17, a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon, a child's tooth, a small glass vial containing what was later determined to be mercury, and a folded paper covered in text, written in a cipher that has never been successfully decoded. The watch bore the initials E.H. on its case. The hair was later confirmed through comparison with preserved samples to have belonged to Elijah Holloway. The origins of the tooth and the nature of the coded message remain unknown. As October of 1888 progressed, Catherine's entries show her and Margaret establishing new routines in the wake of Edmund's death and Rebecca's departure. They received few visitors. They declined invitations to social events typical for a family in mourning. Instead, they spent increasing amounts of time in Edmund's former study and in the cellar that had previously been a source of such unease. October 25th, M has completed her father's calculations. She says the alignment occurs on November the 21st, not the 18th as E had determined. I trust her mathematics more than his. His mind was already beginning to slip when he made his computations. We've prepared the cellar according to the specifications. The eastern wall no longer weeps. Instead, it listens. M placed her ear against it yesterday and smiled in a way that reminded me so much of E in his younger days. She said she could hear the other side waiting. The final pages of Catherine's diary detail elaborate preparations for some significant event scheduled for November 21st. She lists materials purchased, candles made of specific types of wax, unusual minerals ordered from a specialty shop in Boston, rare herbs that a local apothecary had to source from overseas suppliers. None of these items were ever found in subsequent searches of the property. The second-to-last entry, dated November 20th, reads, "Tomorrow completes what we began in January. The cost has been higher than I anticipated, but the rewards will justify all." M shows such aptitude. She understands intuitively what took E years of study to grasp. Last night she told me she's been dreaming of Elijah. In her dreams, he stands at a crossroads and calls her name. I've instructed her to ignore these dreams. The mind creates distractions when on the cusp of transformation. Sentiment is the enemy of progress. E never understood this, which is why he hesitated at the crucial moment. M, and I will not make the same mistake. The final entry, dated November 21st, consists of just 5 words. It is done. God forgive me. What happened on November 21st, 1888 in the Holloway home remains one of Salem's most enduring mysteries. No police reports were filed. No unusual sounds or activities were reported by neighbors. The next documented information about the Holloways comes from a Salem Evening News article dated December 4th, which notes simply that Mrs. Catherine Holloway and her daughter, Miss Margaret Holloway, have relocated to the countryside for the benefit of their health following their recent bereavement. Property records show that the Holloway home was sold in January 1889 to a merchant named Thomas Blackburn, who converted the upper floors into separate apartments while maintaining the ground floor as a bookshop. Blackburn's business ledgers, preserved in the Salem Historical Society, contain an unusual note from February 1889, addressed persistent damp smell in northeast corner of shop. Replaced section of floorboards and plastered over strange markings found on subfloor, old houses and their secrets. The trail of Catherine and Margaret Holloway goes cold after their departure from Salem. No record of either woman appears in Massachusetts' vital records or census data following 1888. However, in 1912, a woman named Elizabeth Winters, possibly using the surname of the former Holloway servant, Rebecca Winters, as an alias, appeared in Providence, Rhode Island. This woman claimed to be the niece of Catherine Holloway and produced several items that had belonged to the family, including Edmund's university degree and a distinctive brooch known to have been Catherine's. Elizabeth Winters told Providence authorities that she was the sole surviving heir of the Holloway family and wished to sell some family heirlooms to support herself. When questioned about what had happened to Catherine and Margaret, she reportedly became agitated and said only, "They completed their work and went where they needed to go." The items Elizabeth Winters sold went to various collectors and museums. One such item, a small leather-bound journal that had belonged to Edmund Holloway, eventually made its way to a private collector in Boston named Frederick Armitage. In 1927, Armitage permitted a scholar from Miskatonic University to examine the journal as part of research into New England maritime trade. This scholar, Dr. William Moore, discovered that what appeared to be a standard business journal contained a hidden text. Edmund had used a simple cipher to conceal personal notes within what seemed like ordinary business records. When decoded, these notes revealed Edmund's growing concern about his wife's psychological state in the years leading up to 1888. According to Dr. Moore's published findings, Edmund wrote, "C becomes more fixed in her delusions with each passing month. She speaks now of sacrifices and bargains as though conducting ordinary business negotiations. I have consulted Dr. B. privately, but he offers little hope without institutional intervention, which I cannot bear to consider. I fear most for E and M, who are exposed daily to their mother's deteriorating condition. E shows signs of adopting some of her strange beliefs, while M remains mercifully skeptical. R is my only ally in maintaining some semblance of normalcy in the household, though C watches her with increasing suspicion." This entry, apparently written in late 1887, suggests a very different household dynamic than Catherine's diary portrays. If Edmund's account is accurate, it raises the possibility that Catherine's diary represents the documentation of elaborate delusions rather than actual events. Yet this theory fails to account for the physical evidence found years later, the unexplained disappearance of Elijah Holloway, and the subsequent vanishing of both Catherine and Margaret. If Catherine was suffering from a mental disturbance, what happened to her daughter? What became of Elijah beyond his train journey to Boston? And how do we explain the precise, almost prophetic nature of some of Catherine's writings about events that occurred long after her disappearance? In 1917, nearly 30 years after the Holloways left Salem, an unusual incident occurred at their former home, by then converted into a boarding house. A tenant named James Collins, who occupied what had once been Edmund's study, reported waking in the night to find a young woman standing at the foot of his bed. According to his statement to the landlord, the woman was dressed in the fashion of a previous generation, and asked him, "Is the eastern wall still weeping?" When Collins rose from his bed, the woman reportedly walked through the closed door leading to the hallway. Collins gave notice the following day and moved out within the week. The landlord dismissed the story as a nightmare or hallucination, but 3 subsequent tenants of the same room reported similar experiences over the next decade. The room remained vacant for much of the 1920s, despite being offered at a reduced rate. In 1931, during extensive renovations to the property, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall between the study and what had been Margaret's bedroom. Inside was a small leather case containing a set of surgical instruments dating to the mid-19th century and a handwritten manuscript entitled Observations on Transference of Vital Essence, attributed to one Dr. Ambrose Pierce, dated 1866. The manuscript has since vanished from the Salem Historical Society archives, where it was initially deposited, with the last recorded examination occurring in 1947. The renovation also uncovered something more disturbing in the cellar. Behind the eastern wall that Catherine had described as weeping, workers found a small chamber that did not appear in any of the original architectural plans for the house. The chamber, roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, contained no remains or personal items, only a chair, a small table, and hundreds of tally marks scratched into the stone walls. Each mark appeared to have been made with a different implement, from sharp tools to what forensic experts later suggested were human fingernails. The discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the property, but no additional chambers or significant findings were reported. The small room was sealed up again during the renovation, with the current owner deciding that opening a literal skeleton closet in a historic Salem home would do nothing for property values or the mental well-being of tenants. The most intriguing development in the Holloway case came in 1954, when a manuscript was donated anonymously to the Essex Institute, now part of the Peabody Essex Museum. The manuscript, written in what experts confirmed was Margaret Holloway's handwriting, was titled simply The Method and dated October 1888. The text describes in scientific terminology a theoretical process for transferring life energy from one individual to another, with detailed illustrations of the human nervous system alongside more abstract diagrams of what Margaret termed ethereal pathways. The manuscript reads less like an occult text and more like a medical thesis, albeit one based on concepts far outside mainstream scientific understanding of the era. A particularly chilling passage reads, "The conventional understanding of death as a terminal event is fundamentally flawed. Life essence, properly understood, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transferred, concentrated, or dispersed. Through careful application of the principles outlined herein, it is possible for a prepared recipient to accept the essence of a willing donor, thereby extending their natural lifespan beyond ordinary limits. Familial connections provide the strongest conduits for such transference, with maternal, filial links offering optimal conditions. The ethical implications of such procedures are beyond the scope of this technical document." The manuscript ends abruptly in mid-paragraph, as though the author was interrupted while writing. Museum curators noted water damage on several pages, and chemical analysis indicated the presence of salt water rather than fresh water, curious for a document originating in inland Salem. In 1967, a journalist investigating the Holloway case discovered a peculiar entry in the records of a small private sanitarium in western Massachusetts. The entry, dated January 1889, records the admission of a Mrs. H.S. from Salem, described as suffering from acute delusional episodes and dangerous fixations. The patient was admitted by her daughter M., who paid for 1 year of care in advance. According to the sanitarium records, Mrs. H. claimed that she had successfully transferred her son's life essence into her husband to prolong the latter's life, but that the process had been imperfect, resulting in her husband's painful deterioration. She further claimed that she and her daughter had refined the method and completed a more successful transference on November 21, 1888, though the sanitarium records don't specify the donor or recipient in this alleged second attempt. The patient remained at the facility until October 1889, when she reportedly died of natural causes related to advanced age and general debility, despite being only 43, according to the admission records. The daughter never returned to visit after the initial admission and did not respond to telegrams informing her of her mother's death. The body was buried in the sanitarium's cemetery under a marker bearing only the initials C.H. In 1971, the sanitarium grounds were purchased for development into a shopping center. During the exhumation and relocation of graves from the old sanitarium cemetery, workers were unable to locate the grave marked C.H., despite having clear records of its location. The development company attributed this to poor record-keeping and marker displacement over time, but some involved with the project suggested the grave appeared to have been previously disturbed. The last significant piece of the Holloway puzzle emerged in 1983, when a retired librarian from Salem named Dorothy Jenkins came forward with a story about an encounter she had as a young woman in 1921. According to Jenkins, she was working late at the Salem Public Library when an elderly woman entered just before closing time. The woman, who walked with a cane and wore outdated clothing, requested assistance finding materials related to the Holloway family. Jenkins recalled that the woman's request struck her as odd because she asked specifically about the Holloway transference incident, a phrase Jenkins had never heard, despite her familiarity with local history. When Jenkins inquired why she was interested in the Holloways, the woman reportedly smiled and said, "I'm gathering information for my autobiography. I've lived quite a long time, you see, far longer than nature intended." Jenkins provided the woman with what few materials the library had on the family and observed her from the circulation desk. She described watching the elderly visitor examine a photograph of the Holloway family from the 1880s with particular intensity, running her finger over the image of young Margaret Holloway. As closing time approached, Jenkins informed the woman she would need to leave. The visitor thanked her and said, "It's fascinating to see how history records things. They never get it quite right, do they? For instance, they all think Catherine was the architect of what happened to our family. But it was Margaret who found the book first. Margaret who convinced her mother it could work. The daughter leads, the mother follows. Isn't that always how progress occurs?" Before Jenkins could respond, the woman gathered her belongings and departed. Jenkins followed her to the door, watched her descend the library steps with surprising agility for her apparent age, and then disappear into the fog that had rolled in from the harbor, a detail that Jenkins felt was important enough to include 60 years later when recounting the story. Jenkins never saw the woman again, but her description of the visitor matches photographs of Catherine Holloway in her 40s, except that this encounter would have taken place when Catherine would have been in her 70s, if she were still alive. More strikingly, the visitor used phrasing, our family, and the reference to Margaret in the third person that has led some researchers to speculate that the elderly woman might have been Margaret Holloway herself, by then in her 50s. The true fate of Margaret Holloway remains unknown. No death certificate exists for her in Massachusetts or any surrounding states. No marriage records bear her name. She simply vanished from official documentation after leaving Salem with her mother in December 1888. However, an intriguing lead emerged in 1992, when a researcher examining passenger manifests from New England ports discovered a listing for a M. Holloway, age 17, departing Boston on January 3, 1889, bound for Liverpool, England. The same name appears on British immigration records and subsequently in the Registry of Students at the Edinburgh Medical School, which had begun admitting female students in 1889. This Margaret Holloway completed her studies in 1894 and appears to have practiced medicine briefly in London before her license was revoked due to unorthodox procedures and concerning patient outcomes. The medical board records cite specifically her unhealthy preoccupation with theoretical transference of vital energies between patients and unauthorized surgical procedures. After losing her medical license, this Margaret Holloway disappears from British records until 1903, when a woman of the same name appears as a passenger on a ship from Southampton to New York. Immigration records at Ellis Island show her profession listed as researcher and her age as 32, which would match the Margaret Holloway of Salem. From this point, traces of a Margaret Holloway appear sporadically across the United States over several decades. A Margaret Holloway is recorded teaching anatomy at a women's college in Pennsylvania from 1905 to 1912. A physician named Dr. M. Holloway briefly operated a rejuvenation clinic in Chicago in the 1920s before closing abruptly following an investigation by local authorities. Most notably, a Margaret Holloway appears in Los Angeles records in 1947 as the founder of the Holloway Institute for Longevity Studies, which operated until 1953 when it was shut down following the unexplained deaths of several wealthy patients. The director of this institute was described in newspaper accounts as being remarkably youthful in appearance despite her advanced years. By the time authorities moved to arrest Margaret Holloway in connection with the deaths at her institute, she had vanished again. The final confirmed reference to anyone who might have been Margaret Holloway comes from a small obituary in a Portland, Oregon newspaper dated 1976. Which mentions the passing of a Margaret H. Winters, age 106, formerly of Massachusetts. The obituary notes that Ms. Winters had no known surviving relatives and had requested cremation with no services. If this was indeed Margaret Holloway, she would have been born in 1870, making her actually 106 at the time of her death. An unusually long lifespan for that era, particularly for someone who reportedly remained sharp of mind and steady of hand until her final days, according to the one neighbor quoted in the obituary. The Holloway case remains officially unsolved. No charges were ever filed in connection with the disappearance of Elijah Holloway or the deaths of Edmund and Catherine. The diary and associated materials reside now in the special collections of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, accessible only to qualified researchers with approved research proposals. The house on Essex Street still stands, though it has been extensively renovated over the years and now houses a law office. Current occupants report no unusual experiences, though the building's historical significance makes it a regular stop on Salem's many ghost tours, much to the annoyance of the attorneys who work there. What actually happened to the Holloway family in 1888? The documentary evidence suggests several possibilities, none entirely satisfactory. The psychological explanation that Catherine suffered from delusions that eventually infected her daughter and led to tragedy fails to account for the physical evidence found decades later. The criminal explanation that Catherine and possibly Margaret were responsible for the deaths of Edmund and Elijah lacks any clear motive and doesn't explain the elaborate theoretical framework described in Margaret's manuscript. And then there's the explanation that Catherine herself offered in her diary, that the family entered into some sort of pact, a methodology for transferring life essence from one person to another. As implausible as this sounds to modern ears, it would explain the family's strange behavior, the disappearance of Elijah, followed by Edmund's prolonged decline, and the apparent longevity of someone who might have been Margaret Holloway. Whatever the truth, the case of the Holloway family stands as one of Salem's most disturbing mysteries, not because of spectral apparitions or supernatural curses, but because it suggests the darkest capabilities of human determination when faced with mortality and decline. The true horror of the Holloway case lies not in what might have been conjured from beyond, but in what might have been awakened within. In 1998, during a digital archiving project at the Peabody Essex Museum, a technician made an unsettling discovery. When photographing Catherine Holloway's diary under ultraviolet light to preserve faded passages, previously invisible text appeared on several pages. This hidden writing, apparently done in some form of sympathetic ink, contained additional details not visible to previous researchers. One such passage, appearing in the margins of the November 20th entry, reads, M says the process requires 3 participants, the vessel, the conduit, and the recipient. E was our first vessel, but his essence was divided improperly between us, leaving him in that terrible half-state. For tomorrow's attempt, I have agreed to serve as the vessel. MCU will be both conduit and recipient. She has always been stronger than me. She will carry our work forward after I am gone. This discovery led to renewed interest in the Holloway case among medical historians and bioethicists. Several scholarly articles published in the early 2000s examined the Holloway documents in the context of early scientific understanding of human physiology, suggesting that Margaret's transference theory might have been a misguided attempt to conceptualize energy exchange between living organisms based on the limited scientific knowledge of her era. Dr. Eleanor Richards of Harvard Medical School, in her 2003 paper, The Holloway Protocol, Proto-Scientific Inquiry or Delusion, proposed that Margaret Holloway might have been observing real but misunderstood biological phenomena. What Margaret Holloway described as life essence could have been her attempt to understand cellular energy or even genetic inheritance, without the vocabulary or framework to properly conceptualize these concepts. Her detailed observations of physical responses during what she termed transference sessions include descriptions of symptoms we now recognize as consistent with various medical conditions. Richards further suggested that the Holloways may have been experimenting with substances that induced altered states of consciousness, potentially including ergot derivatives that were sometimes used medicinally in the 19th century. This could explain the perceptual distortions described in Catherine's diary and the apparent sincere belief that something supernatural was occurring. Yet no purely scientific explanation seems to fully account for all aspects of the case, particularly the physical evidence found decades after the events and the apparent longevity of the woman who may have been Margaret Holloway. If we are to believe the scattered records tracing her possible movements through the 20th century, she lived well beyond the typical lifespan of her era, while maintaining unusual vitality. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Holloway case is the suggestion that their work continued beyond 1888. If the elderly woman who visited Salem Public Library in 1921 was indeed Margaret Holloway, and if the Margaret Holloway who operated the Longevity Institute in Los Angeles was the same person, then whatever method she and her mother developed in that house on Essex Street may have been refined and practiced for decades afterward. How many others might have been vessels in an ongoing experiment that began with Elijah and Edmund Holloway? The death records of patients at the Chicago Rejuvenation Clinic and the Los Angeles Institute show consistent patterns. Elderly, wealthy individuals who died of apparent natural causes, but who exhibited unusual symptoms in their final days, including extreme disorientation, hypersensitivity to light, and what one nurse described as a hollowness behind the eyes, as though something essential had been removed. In 2007, a descendant of Rebecca Winters, the Holloway servant who fled to Baltimore, donated a collection of family papers to the Salem Historical Society. Among these was a letter Rebecca wrote to her cousin in 1901, following news reports about the discovery of Catherine's diary. In this letter, Rebecca offers what may be the most direct eyewitness account of what happened in the Holloway household. What the newspapers report about Catherine's writings does not surprise me, though they mistake madness for what was in truth something far worse. I served that family for 11 years and watched as Catherine's fascination with mortality grew from scholarly interest into obsession. After Edmund's shipping investments failed in '85, her fear of poverty and decline consumed her. It was Elijah who first brought home that terrible book, a medical text, he claimed, though the diagrams inside bore little resemblance to human anatomy as I understood it. He had purchased it from a foreign doctor who had been dismissed from Massachusetts General Hospital for unethical practices. Catherine and Edmund spent months studying this book, often working through the night. I would find them in the morning, still bent over its pages, having not slept. They began experimenting first with small animals, a practice I protested until Catherine dismissed me from the room. Later, I would find the remains buried in the garden. When Elijah became ill in January of '88, they grew desperate. I overheard arguments about the process and the necessary sacrifice. By February, Elijah seemed to recover somewhat, but Edmund began to decline in exactly the ways Elijah had been suffering. It was as though the illness had been transferred from son to father. I might have dismissed this as coincidence, but for what Catherine said to me one night when Edmund was at his worst. She came to the kitchen where I was preparing his broth and said, "Rebecca, we've done something wonderful and terrible. We've taken what was killing Elijah and given it to Edmund instead, a father's final gift to his son. I left that house because I could not bear to watch what Margaret was becoming under her mother's guidance." The girl who had once been kind and full of normal youthful interests became cold, analytical in her observations of her father's suffering. She spoke of his deterioration as fascinating and kept detailed notes on every change in his condition. What haunts me most is my final conversation with Catherine. The night before I fled, she confided that the process they had used with Elijah and Edmund was imperfect, but that she and Margaret had refined it. She said, "The next transference will be complete. No lingering, no half measures. A clean exchange." When I asked who would be involved in this exchange, she smiled at me in a way that made my blood run cold and said, "Only family, dear Rebecca." Only family. I knew then that I had to leave, though I have carried the guilt of abandoning Margaret to her mother's influence ever since. Rebecca's letter provides context for Catherine's diary entries and suggests that whatever occurred in the Holloway home was not merely psychological, but involved concrete actions with observable results. Whether these results were achieved through pharmaceutical means, psychological manipulation, or some methodology lost to history remains uncertain. The final piece of the Holloway puzzle may lie in a collection of medical archives currently held by a private collector who acquired them following the closure of a research hospital in upstate New York in the 1980s. According to catalog descriptions, these archives include patient records and research notes from a Dr. Margaret H. Winters, who conducted longevity studies from 1954 to 1968. The collector has thus far denied access to researchers, citing privacy concerns and the potentially sensitive nature of the materials. However, a former employee who assisted in cataloging the collection has stated that Dr. Winters' notes include references to a Holloway protocol and detailed case studies of patients who purportedly experienced radical cellular rejuvenation following specialized treatments. Perhaps most disturbing is the employee's claim that among Dr. Winters' personal effects was a locket containing a daguerreotype of a young man labeled on the reverse as Elijah H., my beloved brother, forever with us. If authentic, this would suggest that the doctor was indeed Margaret Holloway, still carrying a memento of the brother who may have been the first vessel in their family's terrible experiment. In 2011, an archaeological survey was conducted at the site of the former sanitarium in western Massachusetts, where Catherine Holloway supposedly died. Ground-penetrating radar identified an anomaly in the area where her grave should have been. When excavated, researchers found not human remains, but a small lead box identical in design to the one discovered beneath Essex Street in 1920. This second box contained only 3 items: a woman's wedding band engraved with the initials CH to EH, a small vial of dried liquid that testing revealed to be human blood with traces of an unidentified compound, and a handwritten note that read simply, "The vessel emptied, the transfer complete, November 21, 1888. The archaeological team's report concluded, "The evidence suggests this was a ceremonial burial rather than a human interment." The placement of symbolic items in lieu of a body indicates a ritualistic significance that aligns with the unorthodox beliefs attributed to the Holloway family through their writings. In the absence of definitive answers, the Holloway case has inspired numerous theories ranging from the prosaic to the fantastic. Some modern analysts have suggested that Catherine and Margaret were early practitioners of what we might now call psychological manipulation or coercive control, using Edmund's genuine illness and their isolated family dynamic to create a shared delusion that allowed them to escape the limitations placed on women in late 19th century society. Others point to the physical evidence and the unusual longevity of the woman presumed to be Margaret Holloway as indication that something beyond current scientific understanding may have occurred in that house on Essex Street. These theorists often cite the detailed technical nature of the method manuscript as evidence that Margaret had developed a procedure that, while couched in the quasi-scientific language of her era, may have accessed biological mechanisms not yet fully understood by modern medicine. A third theory, popular among some medical historians, suggests that the Holloways may have inadvertently stumbled upon an early form of blood transfusion or cellular therapy, misinterpreting its effects through their limited understanding of human physiology. This theory points to the surgical instruments found hidden in the house and the presence of blood in both lead boxes as evidence of physical procedures rather than merely symbolic rituals. Whatever the truth, the documented facts remain unsettling. A family destroyed, a son who vanished, a husband who wasted away while his wife documented his decline with clinical detachment, a daughter who may have lived far beyond her natural lifespan while leaving a trail of deceased patients across decades and states, and physical evidence that defies simple explanation. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Holloway case is that their method, whatever it entailed, appears to have been developed through a systematic process of trial and error rather than supernatural revelation. The technical precision of Margaret's manuscript and the calculated nature of Catherine's diary entries suggest not madness, but methodical experimentation, a family working together to solve the problem of mortality through whatever means necessary, regardless of the cost. In 2015, a previously unknown document surfaced at an estate auction in Oregon, a leather journal identified as belonging to a M.H. Winters, with entries dating from 1950 to 1975. The journal was purchased by a private collector who permitted a single researcher from the University of Washington to examine it under controlled conditions. According to this researcher's published findings, the journal contains reflections by an elderly woman looking back on a long life of scientific inquiry, while never explicitly stating her identity as Margaret Holloway. The author makes numerous references to My Work in Salem and Mother's Sacrifice. Most significantly, she describes a lifelong quest to perfect what she calls the transference process, while lamenting its fundamental limitation. After all these decades, the essential problem remains unsolved. The transfer requires a vessel willing to be emptied. Mother understood this necessity and embraced it, but willing vessels have proven increasingly difficult to find. Those who seek extension fear emptiness, too much to serve as vessels themselves, creating an inevitable ethical dilemma. My own time now grows short, and I find myself without a suitable conduit or vessel. Perhaps this is fitting, that what began with family should end with its last member. The journal's final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Margaret H. Winters' reported death in 1976, contains a passage that continues to disturb those familiar with the case. I dreamed of Elijah again last night. He stood at the crossroads as he always does, but this time he beckoned to me. After all these years of avoiding that invitation, I find myself tempted to accept. What would I discover if I followed him? Would I find Mother and Father waiting? Would they forgive what we did in that house on Essex Street? Would I forgive myself? Tomorrow I will visit the water once more. The ocean always clarifies my thinking. Margaret H. Winters' death certificate indicates she was found on the beach near her Oregon coastal home, apparently having died of natural causes while walking along the shore. The medical examiner noted no signs of trauma or foul play, though he remarked on the deceased's unusually well-preserved condition given her advanced age. This brings us back to the central mystery of the Holloway case. What actually happened in that house on Essex Street in 1888? Did Catherine and Margaret develop some method of transferring life energy that allowed one family member to extend their existence at the expense of another? Or was this elaborate documentation merely the record of a shared delusion that nevertheless resulted in very real deaths and disappearances? Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that both explanations contain elements of truth, that the Holloways, driven by fear of mortality and decline, developed techniques of physical and psychological manipulation that produced observable effects they interpreted through the scientific framework available to them. That their method, while not supernatural, nevertheless allowed them to influence life and death in ways that conventional medicine of their era could neither achieve nor explain. If Margaret Holloway did indeed live as Margaret Winters until 1976, she witnessed nearly a century of scientific advancement, from horse-drawn carriages to space exploration, from primitive surgical techniques to organ transplantation. One wonders how she reconciled her early understanding of life essence with the emerging concepts of DNA, cellular biology, and modern medical science. Did she recognize elements of her own work in these discoveries? Or did she maintain a separate paradigm until the end? The Holloway case resists definitive resolution, existing in that uncomfortable territory between documented fact and unverifiable possibility. What can be stated with certainty is that something unusual occurred in that house in Salem, something that resulted in the dissolution of a family and the creation of a methodology that may have influenced lives and deaths far beyond Essex Street. In 2018, the current owners of the Holloway home on Essex Street undertook extensive renovations to convert the building back to a single-family residence. During the process, workers removing lath and plaster from an upstairs bedroom discovered a small cavity in the wall containing a glass bottle sealed with wax. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. When carefully extracted and unfolded by conservators, the paper revealed a letter written in what handwriting experts confirmed was consistent with samples of Margaret Holloway's writing. The letter, dated November 20th, 1888, the day before the final diary entry, was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." It read, "By the time this is discovered, I will likely be gone from Salem, perhaps from this world entirely. Tomorrow Mother and I complete the work that has consumed our family for nearly a year. She believes she has prepared me fully for what is to come, but I harbor private doubts that I have not shared with her. The process we have refined requires 3 participants, a vessel to be emptied, a conduit to direct the transfer, and a recipient to be filled. In our first attempt, Elijah served as conduit while Father was the vessel, and I the recipient. The result was imperfect. Father lingered in a half state, neither fully emptied nor properly deceased, while I received only fragments of what should have been transferred. Tomorrow, I am to serve as both conduit and recipient, with Mother as the vessel. She believes this will result in a complete and successful transfer, but my calculations suggest another possibility. What if the conduit absorbs what is transferred rather than merely directing it? What if tomorrow I become not just myself, but also my mother, as I already carry pieces of my father and brother? The ethical implications of our work have increasingly troubled me, though Mother dismisses such concerns as sentimental obstacles to progress. Is it right to extend one life at the cost of another, even with consent? And what becomes of the essence that is transferred? Is it truly preserved, or merely absorbed and diluted within the new host? I leave this record hidden, not as confession, but as data, another piece of the puzzle for some future researcher who may understand what we have only begun to glimpse. Judge us not by the standards of your time, but by the desperate hope that drove our inquiries, that death might be not an end, but a transition, that what makes us ourselves might continue beyond the failure of our physical forms. To whoever finds this, search for MH. If I have survived and succeeded, I will carry the answers you seek." The letter was donated to the Peabody Essex Museum, where it joined the other Holloway documents in the special collections. Curators noted that it provides the clearest direct statement of the family's activities while raising even more questions about what actually occurred on November 21st, 1888. The story of the Holloway family serves as a disturbing reminder of how far human beings might go to conquer their most fundamental fear, the fear of ending, of ceasing to be. It suggests that the true horror lies not in supernatural forces or external threats, but in what we ourselves might become when driven by the desperate desire to continue at any cost. Salem has many ghost stories, tales of witchcraft and curses that draw tourists and thrill seekers. But those who know the true story of Catherine Holloway and her family understand that the most terrifying hauntings are not spectral, but psychological. Not the dead reaching back toward life, but the living reaching forward beyond their allotted time, willing to sacrifice others to extend their journey. The house on Essex Street stands quiet now, restored to its original beauty, with no placard or marker to indicate the terrible experiments that may have occurred within its walls. Tourists walk past it daily on their way to more famous Salem landmarks. unaware of the family who once lived there, or the pact they may have made with each other rather than with supernatural forces. And somewhere, perhaps, in archives yet to be fully examined, or collections still in private hands, more pieces of the Holloway puzzle wait to be discovered. More glimpses into a family that sought to rewrite the rules of mortality through determination, desperation, and a willingness to sacrifice what others would not. For now, the case remains what it has always been, a disturbing fragment of history that refuses simple categorization or explanation. A reminder that sometimes the most unsettling stories are those that might, just might, be true. In the words of Dr. Eleanor Richards, who has spent decades studying the Holloway documents, what makes this case so disturbing is not the possibility that Catherine and Margaret discovered something supernatural. It's the possibility that they discovered something natural that we still don't fully understand, something about human biology, psychology, or consciousness that allowed them to influence life and death in ways that seemed miraculous in their era, but might eventually be explained by science in ours. The true horror is not that they were dabbling in the impossible, but that they might have stumbled upon something all too possible. The final word on the Holloway case may belong to Margaret herself, if indeed she was the elderly woman who visited the Salem Library in 1921 and spoke to the young Dorothy Jenkins. According to Jenkins's account, as the woman was leaving, she paused at the door and said something that Jenkins didn't include in her original statement, but added years later in a private letter to a researcher. The young librarian asked me if I believed in ghosts, a common question in Salem, as you might imagine. I told her that I didn't believe in ghosts, as most people conceive them, but that I did believe one could be haunted by choices, rather than spirits. She seemed confused by this, so I elaborated, "My dear, I have lived with the essence of 3 people inside me for over 30 years now. Sometimes they whisper suggestions, sometimes they fall silent for years, but they are always there, fragments of consciousness preserved, but not truly living. That is the truth that my mother never understood, that what we preserved was not life, but memory, not continuation, but echo. The real horror is not that the dead might return, but that they might never truly leave.